Habemus Papam, we have a pope, and he has taken the name Leo, recalling the great age of Catholic social teaching. It's a very compact story. We'll also discuss reports that the Trump administration may be preparing to accept the gift of a luxury airliner from Qatar, the repressive Gulf state. I'm joined by Ashley Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So, I had some champagne last week after the election of Pope Leo. Don't really know how this Pope will work out, but I figured, hey, why not celebrate? How bad can it possibly be? Were the non-Catholics on the pod also using this as an excuse to imbibe, or how did you all respond?
Yeah, I mean, I once kept a bottle of champagne in my fridge for 5 years to celebrate finishing a book. It took me 7 years to finish the book. So by the time I opened the champagne, it was terrible and yeah. So I'm not one to open champagne willy-nilly, all right? Yeah, well, I am Catholic, right? So but I'm one of these perfunctory Catholics. So I ought to have been much more invested in this than I than I was. But I don't know. I can't get my head around what to make of this particular choice. And everybody's been sleuthing as you do these days. As soon as there's some figure in the news, everyone digs up absolutely everything online of their footprint and their grandma's online footprint. And that's
we
we
aren't yet at the point where a pope has leaked group chats, right? But eventually we'll get to the leaked group chats for a pope.
Oh yeah, but we've got his brother's Facebook posts, and they're spicy. He apparently.
Oh really? I haven't seen these. Spicy in what way?
Oh no, the Guardian's got a full article on his brother's Facebook post, and he's shared
is he
a
like
meme.
a resistance boomer dad, or is he a MAGA
100%
man?
He's a sort of MAGA boomer dad. So he's got tweets
right.
"Your kid's not trans. You're just a bad parent." Sharing a video of Nancy Pelosi calling her a drunk. Was it a drunk C word? Also, and then he says he's speaking to media outlets, but both of his brothers are, and they're like, "Well, we disagree on some things." They're also digging up his genealogical records, but I feel like, I don't know, digging up people's Facebook records and their genealogical records is kind of par for the course now. It's kind of who is this person? I need to know their blood and I need to know their DNA and their digital DNA. So there's this whole thing about people discovering that he's got black grandparents and Haitian ancestry. And I find it so interesting that is not something that the Pope himself has made any statements about. And his brothers say that they never talked about their ancestry. And apparently, when they moved from the South to Chicago, they are listed on the census. They were black, and then they became white. Which can be read in a number of different ways, but obviously for the time period, loads of people. Well, it was more open up north, but loads of people tried to escape prejudice by identifying as white and all that sort of thing. But I mean, why would you make a big deal about your quote unquote racial ancestry? I thought that Catholicism was meant to be universal. In fact, I have said this before, but I think Catholicism is probably the last bastion, ironically, of liberal universalism after the death of political liberalism in the public sphere. So I actually found that to be quite charming and progressive. It was one thing that I noted and thought was worth celebrating.
Yeah, I think the having not just an American Pope, but an omni-American Pope, to use that term, is something to celebrate. And perhaps some speaks more broadly to the continuation of America's mission in the world as a force for universalism indirectly, right? In this case, not through American institutions, but through the institutions of the Catholic Church, which historically have been in many ways at odds with American institutions. I'm going to go on a slight tangent here, which I've probably gone on this tangent before in relation to other extraneous things about the novels of Dan Brown, which, before there was Conclave, the popular movie from last year, which everybody was revisiting, last week during the Conclave decision, there was Angels and Demons, the novel by Dan Brown prior to the Da Vinci Code, the better known Da Vinci Code. And it's similarly a novel whose drama revolves around a conclave and sort of intrigue within a conclave. And, the interesting thing is that it imagines and sort of pits this secret society of Illuminati. It sort of revives this somewhat strange conspiratorial cloak and dagger narrative that emerges in the 18th century, where you have this secretive society supposedly called the Illuminati, and the question of whether they ever existed in any meaningful sense is a very interesting one, which you can find some reflections on in the work of Umberto Eco. But in any case, the Illuminati are this supposedly kind of secretive order of, hardcore secularists. And in this case, in the Dan Brown novel, it's like they're, picking off the various candidates for the various papabile, in order to, somehow disrupt or prevent the ascension of the next pope. At least this is what seems to be happening. If you read the rest of the novel, it proves to be a multi-layered conspiracy, in which nothing is quite what it seems. But the point I take out of Brown's fiction, both Angels and Demons and the Da Vinci Code, is that Brown himself is a New England Protestant, and he grew up on the campus of Phillips Exeter, so the kind of heartland of WASP elites. And I think in some ways his novels really go back to this kind of originary American sort of antagonism towards the Catholic hierarchy, which is rooted in Protestant critiques of Catholicism, its secrecy, its hierarchical structures, its ritual orientation. All of these are very much seen as sort of the antithesis of the American project as it's conceived. And yet, then it turns out that, as you find in Brown's later work, the novel The Lost Symbol, then there's kind of this Freemasonic dimension of the American founding. And of course, there are all kinds of secrecy and hierarchy that can be found in that realm and that history as well. So there's a way that these two things kind of mirror and mimic each other, even as the American project is, in its sort of egalitarian structure and its ideal of openness, and it is sort of conceived of as, deeply opposed to the Catholic project. And so, I think part of the popularity of Brown's novels, kind of comes out of, reviving this sort of deep American kind of suspicion about and concern about the Catholic project, but then also, or the, Catholic political structures, but then also a concern that America itself, through the metastasizing of the deep state and so on, has become very much, like a kind of clone of the Vatican. And so anyway, people can read my very long piece in American Affairs magazine called Mythologies of the Deep State from a few years ago, if they're interested in this line of inquiry. But I guess, what I'm sort of interested in here, and this kind of speaks to Ashley's point about universalism, I would say, is that, there's an interesting convergence here between the American project and the Catholic project, which, again, if you go back to the founding of, at least the sort of mythical founding of America, particularly in New England, right, where you have these people who, have fled England because it's still too what's going on there with this, the Church of England is far too reminiscent of the hierarchical and ritualized nature of Catholicism for them, right? They want something, again, more egalitarian, more open, that eschews ritual. And so, this is really a foundational sort of antithesis. And so I think this sort of synthesis of a kind of omni-American universalism with the church is a very fascinating moment, sort of symbolically, in terms of the unfolding of world history. So, and then the final thing I'd add is, he interestingly is, comes from this kind of, almost quasi-Caribbean, ancestrally, he comes from this kind of quasi-Caribbean realm of the Americas, right, where there's this kind of mixing and this, participation in this kind of broader, more, miscegenated realm of sort of mixed cultures, ethnicities, races, etc. And then, and that is a Catholic, predominantly Catholic part of the Americas. And then he goes and spends, much of his active life as a priest in Peru and actually becomes a citizen of Peru. So that's kind of another vector of this omni-American project. So yeah, it seems like an extremely significant moment, and seems worth celebrating for anybody who has, some kind of belief, as I do, in the value of omni-Americanism.
I like this because Ashley really said, look, Leo, he represents the liberal ideal, and there have long been kind of more traditionalist Catholic concerns about liberalism, modernism, even Freemasonry infiltrating the church. And Ashley saying, well, what if that's not an altogether bad thing? But there are... Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, no, the Dan Brown thing is such an interesting parallel here, because I am a woman of a certain age, and I feel like anybody who was a teenager and reading at that time was reading these books, and I was one of them. But what really bothered me as a Catholic about and I'm remembering something from a long time ago, so forgive me if I've mixed things up, but if I recall correctly, at the end of the Da Vinci Code, the whole conspiracy was that Jesus never died on the cross, and that actually he got married and had children, and that there was this bloodline still alive today. And I was like, so who cares then? Who cares if he had kids? Who cares? The whole friggin' point was that he rose from the dead. There's no Catholicism, there's no religion, there's nothing. If he didn't rise from the dead, they're like, oh, his hallowed. No. The whole project then is meaningless. Like, if that was the case, then there was no point in like preserving anything. And I feel like that is, you're drawing this sort of parallel between American culture and this sort of like Catholicism. And it is really just like this Americanization of Catholicism is kind of writes its culture onto that story, because it's the exact same thing that happened with liberalism, where they took man down from the sky and put him in the dirt. Like, oh, we thought that man was so great, man is rational, man is reasonable. We killed God and put man in his place, and then we realized, oh no, man is actually just an animal, and he's pretty stupid. And then you think, oh, I've done something really important here by questioning the liberal subject, like Dan Brown. Oh, I've done something really important here by questioning, whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. But actually what you did was you destroyed everything. You destroyed the whole project. You made the whole thing meaningless and purposeless. If there is no resurrection, there's no Jesus. If there is no powerful human subject, if there's no rational human subject, if there is no God in the human subject, then the project is dead. You killed liberalism. You didn't like transform it to bring it further. You killed it.
Yeah, the really kind of sense that the Catholic Church is the last vessel of a liberalism that's otherwise been abandoned, or at least of certain kind of democratic and constitutional or universal ideals, probably has its fullest expression in the mid-century book "We Hold These Truths," written by the Jesuit priest John Courtney Murray. And Murray really says, look, the church, with its affirmation of natural law and equal human dignity, is one of the last institutions that is still upholding these ideas on which the American political order is based. And we as Catholics should embrace that and offer it back to Americans, not as our kind of unique inheritance, but as something that belongs to all mankind. So that's probably the most eloquent version of that. I do think Prevost, the new Pope Leo, just in American terms, is interesting and notable. Obviously, the first pope from the Western Hemisphere is Francis, the Argentine, but Francis never returned to Argentina during his papacy. He's an Italian Argentine, and so in a way, the identities he inhabited were at once New World and Old World. He was from Argentina and also, in some sense, an Italian. And so if he inhabited two poles, it was really South America or a certain version of it, and then Southern Europe. Those were the kind of two poles of his career and of his identity. Prevost is interesting because the two poles of his identity are both Western Hemisphere. They're both American. And I think that's a sense in which he's rightly described as omni-American, the term Geoff uses, coined by Albert Murray. He's not just omni-American in the sense of having a mixed racial background. He's omni-American in that he seems to fully contain within his identity a North American, kind of Midwestern white bread identity, and also a South American identity very close to the kind of people of his diocese in Chiclayo, Peru. So he really is this man who seems to sum up the Western Hemisphere in some funny ways. I saw people describing him as the first gringo backpacker pope, kind of joking about this. But it's just a cool moment. I want to take a moment and just reflect on his choice of name, which I mentioned in the opening. Leo, best known as a papal name for the last man to hold the name Leo XIII, the man who really inaugurated the modern era of Catholic social teaching with his famous encyclical Rerum Novarum, which was basically means new things, a response to industrialization, to the after effects of the French Revolution, disruptions in society. And what's really notable about Leo's social teaching is that he took a less denunciatory stance than some of his predecessors had done. Pope Pius IX had issued a syllabus of errors, denouncing the notion that the Pope should reconcile himself to modern conditions. And Leo didn't propose that the Pope should reconcile himself to modern conditions, but he, instead of issuing another syllabus, really looked at reality as it stood on the ground and said, what within this reality can be improved, what can be directed toward better ends, what needs to be criticized. And I think that helped to set the church on the path it took over the course of the 20th century, which was, to increasingly say, look, if there's a false idea of liberty being propounded by the French Revolution, we don't need to denounce liberty as such. We need to offer a truer idea of liberty. If there are false notions of equality being proposed in the political sphere, we don't simply have to continue to assert the prerogatives of throne and altar and bang on about kingship. We can ask what a truer notion of equality would mean. And it seems clear that Leo is going to focus on reasserting, reviving Catholic social teaching. I think it's a very tall task today because Catholic social teaching is in crisis just as the world is. It seems to be less coherent, less incisive than it was in Leo's day. And I don't mean mean this simply because I don't mean this as a criticism of the last Pope Francis. It's been true for some time, and you know, one reason for this is probably the lack of a common theological language in the church. Leo helped to establish the predominance of Thomism as a theological and philosophical approach um, to political and social questions in the church. He really promoted instruction in Thomism for all priests. So, basically any bishop would be pretty thoroughly schooled in the arguments and approaches of St. Thomas Aquinas, and that lent Catholic social teaching a certain coherence and solidity, a kind of set of common terminology that everyone could employ. Maybe not unlike Marxism once provided for portions of the left, but that common language has since been lost, and that's probably one reason for the church's greater difficulty in addressing these social questions. So, Leo faces a lot of challenges, but I would say, Catholics, including it seems the Catholics on this podcast. Sorry, Ashley, I think earlier I sort of temporarily denied your Catholicism, but I want to lift the accidental excommunication I placed on you. I feel really bad about it.
I was confirmed
I think
in
Catholics
everything.
Yeah. I guess that counts. I mean, if the church says you're in, you're in. I can't really kick you out, can I? So, I think it seems the Catholics on this podcast, and I think Catholics elsewhere, feeling pretty good. He's not making a big fuss about himself so far. He's kind of the unassuming pope. And Francis was, more iconoclastic at the outset. He came out on the loggia, that balcony, not wearing the traditional kind of red vestments, but just dressed in white. Simpler apparel. Francis did that, and he checked himself out of his hotel room, settled up his bill. So he was making these gestures, which were very exciting, but also placed him at the center of the story in a very particular way. Leo has kind of faded back into the office and the old forms and is not asserting himself as much. And I think it's not just Francis who's more assertive in certain ways. I mean, Pope Benedict, before he became Pope, he was a prominent figure in the church. He was the doctrinal chief for John Paul II, his predecessor. But one thing that Benedict did do was occasionally offer very spicy comments. There was a book called The Ratzinger Report that came out when he was a cardinal, and he basically had his kind of edgy takes about the church and how it needed to be more conservative in certain ways. Francis, similarly, when he became Pope, to some extent before, had a way of speaking in really vivid terms that were sometimes controversial. Prevost just doesn't have, whether it's the Saints are conservative or liberal, he just doesn't have a record of saying those spicy things. So I do wonder if he'll be a little less divisive than either Benedict or Francis were in their differing ways. I don't get the impression that Prevost would be good at Twitter, whereas Francis was incredible at Twitter. The world is more and more an immense pile of filth. One of the greatest tweets of all time that Francis sent. The world is more and more becoming an immense pile of filth. That was the tweet. And yeah, Benedict, he always had his takes. He had his kind of fiasco where he gave a speech quoting a Byzantine source saying something disparaging about Muslims, and though Benedict wasn't endorsing the idea, it became this fiasco, and he was widely criticized. And he also had another fiasco where he was criticized by conservatives for seeming too open to the use of prophylactics in order to stop the transmission of disease, things like this. But yeah, Prevost, I get the impression that he would have many fewer followers online than Benedict or Francis, and maybe that's okay. Maybe that's actually good.
On the name thing, and you had mentioned at the start that it's a throwback to Leo XIII, and Yeah, I was just thinking that I don't know how to say it properly. Rerum Novarum. Sorry, but it was published in 1891, and
Rerum
that is.
Novarum.
Did I say it right? I did, didn't I?
I don't know. Show some
Yeah.
respect.
I speak Greek, right? So now that like Latin is just beyond me. So I made my choice and I stopped there. Nothing after
Yeah,
Greek.
that's too kind of new and vulgar a tongue for a sophisticated Greek speaker like Ashley.
Right. So but it was published in 1891. That's a very significant time period, and it's a significant in its condemnation of both socialism and laissez-faire capitalism, which is a very like a kind of a cop out kind of critique. But anyways, but these things are both the children of the French Revolution, the children of liberalism, and at that time, that was the sort of first death of liberalism. First, second, probably. I suppose you really wanted to get particular about it, but it was at a time when liberalism was widely seen to have been a mistake and a failure, and this pessimism begins to develop around the last decades of the 19th century that lead us into the horrors of the first half of the 20th century. And it kind of is. It's interesting because I said that the Catholic Church has become this last bastion of liberal values, but it has become that in a way that it is unaware of its being that. And it's a highly kind of precarious receptacle for liberalism, because the thing is, like, monotheism bequeathed to us are the liberal world with man at its center. By placing human beings at the center of the universe, it gives us that possibility of a human-centered world. And I always say it's a debt that's long since been repaid. But after the collapse of this kind of human-centered world, what's left behind is just the potential, just that potential in the Catholic Church of its sort of universalism and its reaching out to everybody being equal in the eyes of God and all that sort of thing. But it does not seem aware of itself in that sense. And I think this kind of throwback to Pope Leo and this, what is very much a kind of encyclical of its time, kind of tells us that Catholicism, at least the church, doesn't seem to realize what it is. And it's Leo seems to be like a branding move. It's like an appeal to one final moment of seeming moral coherence. But really, what could the church? What has been the church's overriding mission? Just be on people's minds a bit. So they're sort of harking back. Oh yes, there was this moment when we had this moral coherence, and there was this production of this text, and it was very much sort of giving people a moral compass. But that time is gone. Dan Hitchens wrote in our magazine this week that what Leo XIII was responding to was like capital and labor. Now what are you responding to? How can the church give moral coherence to stockholders and clouds of pension funds and this sort of, these are the processes. There's no moral coherence to be given. And so what we're doing, what this branding exercise seems to be, is this sort of misguided lack of realization of what the church could be, what it means to do, what it ought to do. And instead it's like so many once authoritative institutions, it's an attempt at grasping for relevance, just in a slightly different way than the previous pope had, which was to sort of grasp at climate change and whatever people seem to be care about or were talking about.
I do think that's a really sharp critique, one that has a real force, and I do think that Pope Leo's choice of name can be seen as probably of a piece with things like the Bernie Sanders campaign, which sought to kind of revive more of a great society model of governance and kind of dragged this old socialist out of obscurity and placed him on the national stage. Or Trump saying, "Make America Great Again," kind of hearkening back to something more like the post-war settlement, if in with a different valence than Bernie. And also something like Compact, which has its own desire to understand and resuscitate the good elements of that economic order. So there does seem to be a lot of kind of solidaristic kind of nostalgia for this middle course between laissez-faire and something more genuinely radical. And the exact reference might change, whether it's Great Society or New Deal or maybe Rerum Novarum, which helped to influence the New Deal through the work of American clerics like Father John A. Ryan, denounced by Father Charles Coughlin as the Right Reverend New Dealer. So yeah, I do see Leo as probably part of a broader wave of nostalgia for something that's lost and that no one has really figured out yet how to reclaim. Anyway, speaking of Make America Great Again, looks like Trump has given up on American manufacturing, at least when it comes to the production of the new Air Force One by Boeing, a much delayed project by America's leading plane manufacturer. And he's instead seemingly prepared to accept the gift of a luxury plane from Qatar. Give me the counterintuitive case for why this is completely fine and totally above reproach.
Let me tell you.
I-
Look, okay. So didn't Clinton take Saudi money for her foundation? Didn't Biden's son work for some Ukrainian gas company? Obama got a Netflix deal. All of these people.
after being in office, to be fair. That would be the difference.
And Trump is getting like what's the word I'm looking, dragged at the moment for like, well, you were sitting there talking about how Biden's a crook and his son is a crook, blah blah blah, and here you are, you're accepting a plane from Qatar. And by the way, I've been watching American news coverage of this, and the way that everyone just pronounces everything willy-nilly in different ways is so. Apparently, it's Qatar. I've been saying Qatar anyway. So the thing about it is when he's questioned, he's looking at the reporters like they're stupid. Like he's like, it's never crossed his mind that you wouldn't do this. He's like, why wouldn't I take a free jet? Why wouldn't I take a free plane? I mean, I could pay for it, but that'd be stupid. They're offering it to me for free. And the thing that makes it, and it just goes with Trump's charm for his followers. I'm speaking like this is probably, I'm saying this is what probably makes him popular. I'm not personally defending him, but this is what makes him charming, what people don't understand, and why he is immune to a lot of these criticisms that are launched against his predecessors, is that in the public sphere, all these people will say, I'm for you, and I'm for social justice, and I'm for the downtrodden, and I'm for this, and I'm for that. But behind closed doors, they will take money. They will do shady deals. They will do all the same things. And Trump just up and does it. He doesn't say, I'm here for you, and I'm for the weak and the downtrodden, and I'm for... No, he's like, this is what businessmen do, isn't it? Isn't it? And he looks around like everybody's stupid. And that's what makes it so incredibly charming, because it is so blatant. And I actually thought it was hilarious in how incredibly dumb and blatant it was, and how that works. Now, I suspect, Geoff, that you're going to complicate this, because it must, of course, be highly complicated, because the deal itself, to the extent it even is a deal, doesn't make any sense at all on security grounds, on timescale grounds, on it on legal grounds, on like, it probably will not happen. But it's just so funny that obviously Trump jumped to accept it without thinking about any of that stuff, because that's all been sort of picked apart at the moment. Like, they'd have to take apart the entire plane to check for bugs and all that kind of stuff. That's not going to happen soon, not faster than Boeing can deliver. But I find it to be so indicative of Trump's peculiar power and charisma that where everyone knew better not to say that out loud, he just says it. And that is what makes him so powerful as a leader, and why this sort of spurning of PR, at least when Trump does it, works. In fact, I'm not even sure that anybody else does it quite so well.
A few comments. One, I still find Qatar, however you want to say it, I've talked, I mean, maybe I've talked about this before on the podcast, but it's a very fascinating place. It's almost the actualization of the dream of globalization as universal peace. Why do I say this? Well, because, you have top Hamas officials there. You have, various other kind of Iranian proxy type entities with, major kind of installations set up there. You also have CENTCOM, the largest U.S. Base in the region there. You have the Israelis have, although they haven't done an Abraham Accords type deal with Qatar, they've certainly had plenty of dealings with and negotiations with them. And so, it seems to be this place where, all of these forces that are ostensibly at war with each other are able to coexist in some sort of strange peace. So there's something kind of fascinating about it as a place. It's a nexus, it's a node of globalization. It's worth noting here that the hardcore libertarians, Quinn Slobodian's recent books have been related to this crack up capitalism. We're obsessed with the Gulf states actually as sort of model polities. And you can sort of see why that is based on what I just said, right? It seems to embody a different kind of political order in which these other sorts of sources of conflict can be bracketed. And to me, this kind of speaks also to something deeper that I've been trying to work out about Trump's thinking about trade, which is obviously very fundamental to how he thinks about the world, which is, as far as I can tell, has something to do with the ideas articulated most famously by the anthropologist Marcel Mauss in The Gift, the famous, I believe, 1920s account of the gift economy as a sort of alternative to the cash nexus or the money economy, and as really the dominant mode of economics that has prevailed throughout most of human history, right? With the rise of the money economy as the sort of default form of economy being a relatively recent development. And, there's a really simple point here, which is just that the way Trump is approaching this is through the logic of the gift economy. His critics are sort of taking it, are thinking about it in terms of dollars and cents. And so they're saying, well, this, is worth 400 million, and that's an illicit sort of inflow of cash into your coffers, which, is a kind of personal enrichment. And, that is against various kinds of corruption laws. But, the way that it's being approached here is through the logic of the gift economy, which is that the purpose of, economic transactions are not an end in themselves. The purpose of them is to seal relationships and to create relationships that will, form the basis of a kind of stable set of social relations, right? And so I think, on some level, this is just a simple illustration, and I don't necessarily think Trump's thinking on this is particularly. I mean, it's certainly not sort of fully articulated on his part. I'm not sure it's particularly coherent. Like, he has an odd way of kind of switching back and forth between the logic of the gift and the logic of the cash nexus. But I think it does illustrate the way that he understands the centrality of the gift economy, in which, again, monetary transactions are a means to another end, which is the forging of relationships. And, that's, I think, what's going on here. And the problem here is that anti-corruption laws and regulations directly target, this precise kind of transaction, because the point of them is, in a sense, to eradicate the logic of the gift economy in order to make the logic of the monetary economy the only licit one available. So I think there's something very fundamental sort of going on here anthropologically. I'll have to think more about this. And I've been thinking about it in terms of trade relations, but I won't go into that theory as of yet. because I still have more to work out.
Now, when I asked you to offer a counterintuitive case for why this was above board, I realized you didn't directly say it was above board, but I did not remotely expect you to say something that would help make sense of what seemed to me a patently absurd transaction. So I just have to take my hat off to you on that. It, look, it seems my proverbial hat. I take my headphones off. It does seem incredible, and I think it's a bit of a vindication of the work we've been doing here at Compact. It seems incredible that Boeing just can't make a plane. I mean,
Yeah.
it can't outfit one, even when there's a high priority given to it by the man who controls, to a great extent, all their business. I mean, Trump is basically the CEO of their main client. Whatever they do, I don't know what it would be. 70% of their business with the U.S. government or something, and they can't make a plane. Bit of an issue. American manufacturing is not going that well. I've seen kind of MAGA Twitter influencers saying that Boeing needs to be nationalized. An illustration that the right is going in some unexpected directions. I don't know if nationalization would help, but it does seem that some kind of reckoning is in order for our, beloved American industries.
Jeff, you hit on something so interesting, because I often describe our contemporary economic system and its tendency toward destruction as a kind of like horrifying potlatch, which I take from Maus. And it's like this, because the potlatch wasn't just gift giving; it's also destruction of can be destruction of resources. And I feel like there's something to that. I mentioned the other day that when we were in a meeting, that I was going to develop a lecture series called the the what the ancient Egyptians can teach us about Bitcoin. And and I find it interesting that there's this kind of reversion to a radical separation of money from like productive activity in the world. I don't know, you're onto something really important there. And I just found that really, really interesting. But there is this kind of you use all these kinds of laws to stop this sort of informal ritual from developing, and yet it seems to be kind of developing nonetheless in this really primitive kind of way. Because I do think that the development of exchange, is a really powerful equalizing thing. But it appears to be breaking down in all sorts of ways, even by this sort of like arch capitalist who's seems to be operating on the logic of the gift. Yeah, and in some ways, war is also this incredible sort of destruction of assets. Anyways, listeners, please make something of that. Write a PhD thesis, because there's something there.
Well, it's Bataille, it's the accursed share. Is just read the opening chapters of that, and it's all kind of there. I think just to briefly outline the trade point, another simple point of illustrating this is it's very strange from the perspective of any kind of normal economics. You saw this in an interview the New York Times did with Stephen Moran, the Council of Economic Advisors, where he was forced to defend this very odd idea that Trump constantly repeats, which is that, when we buy things from another country, when American companies, essentially pay money to import goods from another country, that to his perspective is us giving money away, right? So there's a basic denial of the idea of just exchange value here, or something like that. Like there's an idea that when you take money and take it out of the borders of the United States, then it necessarily is simply being kind of wasted or given away. So this is, on one level, it's extremely odd. And, it was interesting to see Moran kind of forced, because he can't contradict the boss. So he was forced to kind of defend this position, which just from any kind of Econ 101 perspective is completely absurd and nonsensical. But it makes a lot of sense from the perspective of if your baseline is the gift economy. And it also points to a deeper logic, which is that in the logic of the gift economy, the person who gives the most gifts is the one who has power. So in other words, it is on a deeper level true that the United States, by becoming the buyer, the consumer of products from around the world, has solidified its position as global hegemon, right? That this position of, in effect, being the one who, buys all the things from everywhere else is a kind of, even though it is not sort of articulated in gift logic, it functions very much the same way. And so there's a deeper political relation here that underlies the economic one, right? And so I think that's kind of the deeper, I don't know if I want to say wisdom, but sort of, that there's a deeper kind of grasping of how power relations operate at a level more fundamental than that of sort of economic exchange. And I think that, and that, economic exchange only is a kind of secondary effect. So I don't know. I mean, maybe that's and again, I think there are examples or ways you could kind of contradict this based on some of what Trump seems to want. But I think there's some kind of intuition here about the deeper basis of these trade relations being one in which power is articulated on the basis of a kind of gift logic rather than an economic one, even if it expresses itself on the surface in terms of a sort of exchange, a logic of economic exchange.
You can go to compactmag.com and donate now to participate yourself in the logic of gift exchange. The compact is not as powerful as the United States of America. But please go there, donate, and subscribe. Thanks, listeners. Thanks, Jeff and Ashley. And thanks to our producer, Stephen Adebato.